Hi, and welcome to the third part of Lecture 1, Computer Science Research Methods. So we've talked a little bit about why you're doing research, and then we've seen some tools for searching for papers, using keywords and tools to find them that way. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how do you assess the quality of venues where you're publishing. The reason we want to look at this in terms of where is a couple of reasons. But let's start by asking, why do we actually cite papers? Well, one is that we want to relate our own problem to prior work. And in doing that, the quality of that prior work might be important, but really any prior work is valid when we're just trying to relate our problem to prior work. If we want to establish what is the current state of the art, then it's really important that what we're citing is the state of the art. So you have to know how to find that and make sure you're finding it. But the next two reasons are a little bit different. One of the reasons we cite papers is to add credibility to our arguments or our story. We're not just saying, here's some prior problem or here's the state of the art. Often we will use the arguments in those papers to try and make our paper's arguments stronger. This is especially important when you're a junior member of the field and your word doesn't carry as much weight as, say, that senior researcher at MIT, Stanford, or wherever they happen to be. So being able to use someone more credible's story as part of your story is an important thing, in which case it has to be at a good venue, and you have to know who that person is and have reason to want to cite them. The last reason we cite papers is to show the readers, reviewers, we know what is important in prior work, what is solved, and what is still an open problem. That means we have to be very up to date with our references, and also we have to know what is the important places that we should be looking for those works to make sure we've covered them. One of the worst things you can do is cite stuff and say it's an open problem only for the reviewers to say, oh no, that was done by so-and-so in this place. So you need to keep up with those kinds of things. And so sometimes it's not enough to just do a keyword search, which we're going to talk about in your assignment for this week. But in addition, it's important you understand what are the venues. Second reason you want to know about venues is because you're going to publish. And so why are we publishing? So you might have looked at conferences and say, oh wow, that's a cool exotic location. You want to go to Hawaii or France or whatever. And yes, if you have the travel budget, you can go to exotic locations and stay at fancy hotels if you want. I tend to stay at cheap motels, maximize my budget, but that's up to you. You might want to publish to impress your mother with your name in print, or family members or other people. And yes, you can get a certain level of publishing that makes people impressed with your published author and whatever. You'll get through that very quickly. You might think you want to do to become rich and famous. It's unlikely that a single paper, even in the most prestigious of things like Nature, will make you rich or famous, although it might get you 15 minutes of notoriety. So that's not a real reason to publish, although it might come along the way. One of the reasons you're going to do it is you need to publish to graduate. It's a requirement of the program, so you have to find a good enough venue by our department's definition so that you can figure out how to do that and to graduate. But realistically, it's not really just to graduate. We made that requirement because it's really something you need to do to get a job. If you're going to academia, it's absolutely critical. If you're going to industry, it's probably critical. One of the reasons for this is you're graduating from a school where your advisor may or may not be known by the people of the company. But even if they are, most advisors think their students are above average. Of course, can't ever have everyone above average. But it's also a way for the company and or the university that you'd be looking at for a job to get a third arm's length review of how good is your work, because if you're getting into the best venues, then they know that the work is pretty good. This is true especially for the people who are not in your field, who can look at the quality of the publication venues and say, oh yes, this person has 3 papers in this kind of venue and 3 in that kind of venue, and it'll help you get an understanding of what that person's publication record means in terms of the quality of the research they do. Now, there's a couple other reasons you do it, especially after you have a job. You often have to do this to satisfy the research contract requirements. I'm expected to publish as part of all of my contracts. But I think the real reasons you want to do this are to help others learn from your experience and to help grow the body of useful knowledge. This is the real reason we do research, and if we don't publish it, no one knows about it. So another reason to look at this is how are you going to maximize what you can do in terms of helping others learn from your experience, and how are you going to grow the body of useful knowledge. If you do a paper and stick it in your drawer, no one knows about it, no one gains from it. That's not going to work. You want to publish, you don't want to just publish in a place where no one's looking. You want to publish where more and more people look, because that will increase your impact. So if you want to look at scholarly articles, right, these aren't things you find in a magazine in a dentist's office. That would get you published, but that would not really be a scholarly article. Scholarly articles are generally defined as having gone through a peer review. Other scholars have read the articles and approve of them for publication, often with revisions, but once you get them published, they've been through a review process that gives some level of quality assurance to the readers of the articles that these are probably good and trustworthy articles. They tend to have section headings, abstracts, summaries, conclusions, and that can help you both read through the paper quickly and determine what's the author's main ideas. So they're also structured a little bit different. We'll talk about that when we get to writing. They often or generally refer to the work of other scholars through references, in-page citations where you're looking at what a particular person said. Often they'll have an in-depth analysis, and they're going to use the technical language of the field to help inform readers and keep things compact. They appear in journals that don't generally include colorful advertisements. There's a sort of disconnect between the idea of trying to advertise and trying to present honest science, because advertisers would want things that support their point of view. So most journals and conferences don't include advertisements, although sometimes they'll have a page of sponsors or whatever. That's not really bad, but you don't see general ads within the publications. It's really important as you go down this path, and it's becoming more and more important as publishing material has become easier, that you develop a junk antenna. You need to be able to look at something and say, oh no, that's junk. So if you find an article in a subscription database, something like IEEE Explore, InfoTrack, LexisNexis, you'll know that the article has probably been published in print, because inside the database they will tell you where it appeared. If it was physically printed, that gives you some idea of where it is. If the article has been published in a reputable periodical online journal or sponsored by a professional organization like IEEE or ACM, you can assume it's a valid source for research paper citations. But you have to be careful about junk publications, especially junk journals that have been growing very rapidly, and I'll talk about more in a bit. It's allowed to cite things from the web. You can go ahead and take the risk of citing a Wikipedia article, but you have to be very careful that you're checking. You need a very strong check to separate information, real valuable information, from junk. In general, if you find a web article, even a Wikipedia article, it should have primary citations, that is the underlying work that it was based on, and you should go ahead, read those, and cite that instead of trying to cite the web articles. There are times when web articles contain something that you can't find anywhere else because they're trade information, or the number of website hits of a company, or the number of security attacks that have happened in the last year, where you may or may not find a publication because the delay is too long. So we're not going to talk about how to do this. So we've already seen a little bit about how to search using various tools, and we talked about things like IEEE Explorer, Google Scholar, Research, where I've already shown you the demos of those. In our library on campus, there's lots of other databases, and some of those can be actually helpful depending on what specialized things you're looking for. You can also sign up for various mailing lists where you'll be told about publications. I'll go through those again later in the semester after we've had a chance to understand what the quality is. But before we get into how to read, which is our final goal for today, we're going to look at how do we understand the venue quality and some of the metrics that go with it. Now, one of the reasons I'm very interested in looking at citations and looking at that is because various studies, and this is data from the research assessment analysis that goes on in the UK every year, but there have been various studies done in multiple countries where they look at the national ranking as done by sort of a science board and look at the number of publications. And even though the RAE in the UK did not include citation counts as part of what they were doing for ranking, the correlation between the ranking in psychology departments, for example, and their numbers of citations was 0.9, which is a very, very large correlation, and it's generally very high. So the citation counting is more cost-effective and more transparent in terms of who's doing what in terms of good quality research. So the more people are citing your work, the more important it is. Now, to get to citation counts, which we saw a little bit of, we'll come back to those after a little while. But it's important to see why those are going to affect what is the quality of a venue or a journal. So if we're assessing the publication venue quality, it's really about the amount of influence. At one level, the more influence a publication has, the more people that will be impacted by it and know about it, then you're going to have more impact with your work, which is one of your goals. So, for example, the number of readers is important, but in today's world where people rarely subscribe to everything, the number of readers has lost a lot of its importance. There are measures we call journal impact factors, and leading conferences, really only in CS, but because in most other fields, conferences don't matter near as much, but in CS and ECE and a few other high-tech fields, conferences do matter, and then we look at things like acceptance rates or selectivity. So if there were 100 papers submitted to the conference, which makes it very small, let's say there's 1,000 papers submitted to the conference, and 20 of them are accepted, right? Then the conference is extremely selective. They had 1,000 papers, they only accepted 20 of them. If they accepted 200 of them, they're much less selective, but still reasonably selective at 20%. And so you want to look at the selectivity of your conferences. Good conferences tend to have selectivity rates less than 40%, which I think is the requirement for the publications you'll have to have as a PhD student. Another thing to look at is the sort of total number of citations in the H index. And I'm going to explain journal impact factors, citation, and H index in the next couple of slides. So the classic journal impact factor, or just impact factor, is determined by looking at the total number of citations divided by, in general, some window, say 2 years worth of papers. So if some journal X in the years 2005 to 2006 published 158 articles, and in 2007 there were 238 citations to that work, which is done by people who read through all the other journals and figure out how many articles cite other articles, then the impact factor would be 1.5. That is, there's about 1.5 citations per paper that were published. And generally, this is the sort of model of two-year trailing window for what are those impact factors. So what does it mean? Well, first, you have to remember that GIF is a measure of relative currency. It's only good for 2 years. So something that was really good 10 years ago might have dropped. So the good thing is it tracks pretty quickly what's going on. The bad thing is, because it's such a narrow window, if there are mistakes made or if there are citations from conferences that occur every other year, then you can get a very lumpy behavior in terms of what this measure might look like. It's a gross average. The average number of articles in, say, nanoletters, which is a highly cited thing, has 10.37 times. But the citation range is 0 to 319 times, and 14 papers were never cited. In fact, we'll see some plots later. Lots of papers are never, ever cited, except maybe in self-citations, which we tend to ignore. So in the GIF, you actually ignore citations from an author to themselves. Impact factor was really never intended to measure the quality of an individual article or of an author. And even Thomson Scientific, who has the dominant journal impact factor ratings, says that that's its goal. Its goal is to measure an actual publication venue like a particular journal. That's why it's the journal impact factor. So if I want to look at individual articles or individual authors and get a feel for how good is that article or how good is the author, I just can't use the impact factor. I can use absolute citations, but it turns out that there's a better citation metric called the H index or the Hirsch Index. And a Hirsch Index of 45 means a person or department or journal, if you're looking at a larger publication, has 45 articles that are cited at least 45 times, and that's what my H index is. So I have 45 papers over my career that have at least 45 citations each. Now, the biggest of those has over 300, and obviously I have publications with much less. I have a bunch of publications with 0. And so now it's a question of how to calculate this stuff. In the beginning, this was very hard to compute, but now there's a bunch of tools that can do it. So you can look at things like the Web of Science, and there's URL. There's lots of ways of finding it. You will probably find it easier. It is estimated in Google Scholar and Microsoft Academic Index, but be a little wary. Both of those include self-citations in it, and it can be somewhat gamed. I'll talk a little bit about that. So check for self-citations if you're analyzing a person to make sure that there's not a bunch of self-citations hiding in it. And the gaming can be a little bit worse. There are sort of citation cliques that where I cite you, you cite me, and then we don't look like we're cheating because we're not self-citations, but you can still get into problems and find a little bit of that. But it turns out, because this measure requires lots of articles with lots of citations, after you get your H index up to 10 or 15, it becomes very hard to start gaming it because it takes a lot of work to make it happen. So some of the problems with the H index, it rewards longevity. So old folks like me have a higher H index just because I've had lots of papers. but it doesn't really reward least publishable units or sheer quantity because it doesn't really matter. Although quantity does matter because the more papers I have, the more I have a chance of having good work, which has been shown to be the best predictor of quality for overall publications is quantity. Recent and old work are regarded equally, both plus and minus. It doesn't provide highly cited papers more often, so if you have a mega hit with 10,000 citations, it's only one paper in your H index, so it doesn't have as much. So it's not an overall measure. There are a bunch of variants, the G index, M index, I'll talk about those in just a second, that do wage aiding and some other things you can work on. It's relatively insensitive to manipulation. It takes a lot of work to make a huge difference in your H index. And if you do that, chances are it will be detectable by anyone reviewing you, and therefore there's a strong disincentive because if you get nailed for academic dishonesty and manipulating that, your career is pretty much over. Variants of the H index, the G index, which is probably the second most commonly used, very different index, which is the number of papers that received collectively G squared citations. This has the advantage that it rewards highly cited papers because G squared grows faster. So, for example, my H index is 45, but my G index is 72 or something because I have some highly cited paper. The M index is the H index divided by the years a researcher has published, so it's normalized for longevity. So I've been publishing for about 30 years, so my M index is 1.5, my H index of 45 divided by 30. Some variants of these, which are very easily seen and not really separate indices, are things like the HX index, where it's the H index based on citations to the most recent X years. But it includes citations to papers older than those that year. For example, the H5 index in Google Scholar is only looking at citations that occurred in the last 5 years, no matter how old the paper they're citing is. The IY index is the number of papers that have at least 10 citations. So in Google, the I10 index of a scholar tells you how many papers they have that have been cited at least 10 times. And 10 times is sort of paper that's had some level of impact, right? So I have 300 and some papers. I have 110 as my I10 index or something like that. So besides, so these give you some indices. There's various other small places where you can both find papers and citations. So we've already mentioned Google Scholar. There's things like SciFinder, NASA's Astrophysics Data System. Amazon, obviously, oddly enough, can tell you a lot about books, which if you're looking for citations in books. Citations, SpinWeb, and Prola. The Citation Bridge, which is really more about citing patents. In Google Scholar, you can toggle on and off patents. The USPTO can also tell you how many patents have been cited and what were cited by. There's also some of these places have Optics Infobase. These have a bunch of papers, so they're actually repositories as well. CiteSeer was primarily computer science, information science. It was popular for a while. It's actually been dwindling in terms of its ability to tell you what's going on in the field. Science Direct, Info for psychology, IEEE Explorer, Spires, IOP journals, and Crossref. All of these have both indices where they can tell you something about the bibliometrics of papers. They can tell you how often a paper's been downloaded or read or whatever, which are a couple of other metrics. So how many times your paper has been read on ResearchGate, which I forgot to add to this list, right, is a useful metric. How many times it's been downloaded and read by people, even though it's not been cited, it's telling you that it's having an impact. And as more and more places have moved online, that sort of hit count or download count is a useful measure of how much your work might be having an impact. Again, that's useful if you're not gaming it. Those are not considered serious metrics because they're way too easy to game by having bots that just go download stuff. So my take, if you're going to look at this, top quality venues are looked at more favorably for hiring since the time for publication to get citations is short. It's hard for you to have a very high H index or a lot of citations. So in the interim, for beginning people in their career, the quality of the venue is the sort of first thing that people are going to look at. So you want to make sure you're looking at good quality venues for your publications, and good quality venues tend to have better paper. So if you're going to spend time reading, it's a good place to start. If you're going to look at it for an individual or department, you take the H index plus maybe the total citations to all published articles, plus maybe look at the list of top citation papers and see how well are they doing. Total citations can be blown away by one paper with 10,000 citations, and that might have been they just hit on a fad or got lucky. if they have lots of papers with hundreds of citations, then you start to see a solid, repeatable research effort. This will give you a pretty good take on the impact of one's articles or department's articles within the limits of available citation data. Looking at this is shown out in various bibliometric papers to be superior to the journal impact factor in terms of perceived quality by experts, especially in this field of computer science. But in any field where there are publications other than journals, the journal impact factor is a weak measure. So even in fields like history, this turns out to be better because book citations might be more useful than the journal impact factor. Even though Thomson's journal impact factor includes books, it includes a weird subset, so it's very hard to tell how good it is. Whereas Google, if you're looking at Google's citation things, indexes every book they can find and read online. Google does exclude a bunch of things, so it's not like everything is on there. We'll come back to this again after we talk a little bit about open access. So this is a growing trend and something you need to be aware of. So I'm going to give you a short primer on what is open access. Open access simply means free to read. And for many of you, you've grown up in the internet age. You don't want to go pay for a subscription to physical paper mailed to your house to read, like we did when I started. But you don't even want to pay to download, although you do for music and things, so you might be willing to do that. But open access is free to read. Now, it doesn't mean the papers aren't reviewed. It's not like I just randomly put stuff up on my website. Open access is fully compatible with rigorous peer-reviewed, and we'll talk more about that. It doesn't mean that the author pays, although there are many places for which the author pays to get open access to happen. Open access journals or open access publications in general can be low quality or high quality, just like subscription journals. You can pay for junk or you can pay for really good stuff. You can get some junk, lots of junk for free, and you can get some junk, some really high quality stuff for free. So it's not you pay for what you get. Can open access be prestigious? PLOS1, which is maybe the largest scientific journal in the world with an estimated 8,000 articles a year, has a journal impact factor of something around, or did a couple years ago, of 4.35, which is 10th out of the 76 general biology journals. PLOS Biology has a journal impact factor of 12.916, which is 8th out of all the biochem journals, and that's the online version of it. So yes, these are very highly ranked things. CBPR, which is the most highly cited CS publication, and has IEEE has been sort of open access in the sense that we've been publishing an open version of it online for free download since 2011, and we have, as a community, seen substantial increase in the citation rates since that time. It was a very highly cited one before we began our open access experiment, but after that experiment, it has become huge in terms of the increase in its citations. Why? It's really simple. People read papers they can download. If you go to Google Scholar and there's a link to download and read the paper, you're more likely to read it. If you read it, you're more likely to cite it. And we as a community in computer vision recognize that as an important thing and moved our journal to be open access. There are other fields that have had more broadly accepted open access much earlier than us. We weren't the pioneers. We just didn't wait too long to jump on the bandwagon. So is it a flash in the pan? Well, no, it's pretty well established now. The Directory of Open Access Journals, which has largely just the journals, has more than 10,000 open access peer-reviewed journals that have over 2 million articles now. This is actually a slightly older slide. Hundreds of titles are added per day. The open access journal is not the whole story. In fact, almost every journal, not every, 90-some percent, 85%, depending on how you measure it, journals allow authors to deposit their articles in a repository, either a departmental repository or a larger information repository, something like Archive. Often it's a preprint article, a few times it's postprint. It's to your advantage if you choose a journal, any journal that will allow you to put it in a preprint, and we'll talk about that. So why is this important? Well, we publish for prestige, but we also publish to read and be cited, that is to have an impact. Research shows that open access articles in good open access venues, so it still matters how good the venue is, are cited between 25 and 250% more than toll access articles. In my own work, I've seen this where I have some publications that are behind a paywall and therefore hard to get, and others are things like CBPR, which have open access. And the citations between them is clearly differentiable. I can look at them and say the open access ones definitely have had a bigger impact in terms of the number of people who have cited them. I'll show you some data from Lawrence's article. Sort of the number of online papers impact is huge.
And that's from 2001. I think the impact is actually larger now because more and more people have online access, and so it's quicker and easier. Lawrence's article was actually before Google Scholar. Now that Google Scholar will tell you where to find it for free, I think the impact has been much larger. So if we look at some of these, as a scholar, you'll enlarge your impact in your audience. So you want to think about why to go after open access if you can. As a reader, you enjoy free and online access to the literature, and think about that. Every time you're in Google Scholar and you hit something and you can't access the paper, what do? You probably just go find the next article and read that one instead. If you become a teacher, your students have free liability access, fair use, and course back, so you can do a lot of stuff with it. And for all of us, it's really moving us away from an unsustainable journal publishing model in terms of the cost of what those journals are. The amount of money you have to pay for a subscription for a library to have access is quite large. And in many of these cases, the work that's going on, I'm a journal editor. I mean, all of the editors work for free. The cost of a journal is a few staff people that really keep things running, but they still charge hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for library level subscriptions. So coming back to Lawrence's article and sort of the impact, Lawrence looked at how often was an online article cited more than the offline articles published in exactly the same venue. So this was back at a time when there were places where some people did online and some people did not. And on average, 336% more citations occurred to online articles. You can see some articles were cited thousands of times more as the open access versions, or the online open access versions of those papers, compared to other things that appeared in exactly the same venue. So this took out in his study the impact of what is the venue. These were always at the same venue. There were averages over those that were online and those that were not. So the impact is very large. If you think about the research impact, which is what you're trying to do, right? This measures the size of the research contribution to further research. And we talk about publish or perish. You need to build up your reputation by publishing and get people to know who your work is. Otherwise, you will fade as a researcher and disappear from the research community. It can help you generate further research funding, which as a faculty member or as a person in a company is important. The more impact your research has, the more funding you can likely get from more research. It contributes to the research productivity of everybody, and financial support of the research as an institution. It's going to help advance your career. It promotes research progress. In many communities, machine learning community, for example, has been moving to a model where most of the papers at the conferences now are expected to cite papers out of archive, which I briefly mentioned, where you might be citing a paper that was not officially reviewed yet, but might be being reviewed at the same time you are in terms of your publication. So the goal is to reduce the cycle time between when somebody publishes something and when you can build on it down to the smallest possible amount of time you can get. Author or institution self-archive version is a supplement to, not a replacement for, the publisher's official version. And this is part of why I believe it still has a lot of value. If you have a self-archived or institutional supplement to supplement the publisher's official version, part of what happens is you can put that up before the publisher can get it out. We have a paper that was accepted for publication in November. We don't even have a date when it's going to be published, but we've had it up on our as a preprint since it was accepted in November, and people can actually begin citing it. Mostly, we don't have the full dates of when it'll finally show up, but we're telling them to cite the journal version that's going to come out. We just don't know when it'll happen. So you sort of pool and credit downloads for the self-cite archived supplement with the official version, right? Because that's what we're telling people to cite. It gets a little tricky with archive because some people are still citing the original archive version because it was the earliest version, which is one of the ways you often cite stuff. But you can tell them in archive, please cite the journal version, and then you get all the citations will be accrued to the official published version. So there's not a real detriment to the journals to go ahead and do this. So looking at a couple of statistics, one of the reasons this is important is that most papers, as you can sort of see in this plot, right, this is the number of citations. This is, again, based on a UK study. So most of the papers are over here, and they have no citations at all. And the average in terms of papers that are downloaded, the number of hits, the number of downloads, is this sort of exponential-like distribution. Even the papers that are not cited tend to actually have some downloads. People look at them, then they might decide, well, they're not really
that useful or whatever, but they don't cite them. But there's sort of a skew in this. But still, this is a very long tail distribution.
In terms of the impact, the downloads is extremely correlated with the citation impact. So looking at some data from physics, this comes from a paper from a European group. The downloads from the first 6 months after publication predict citations 2 years after publication. The number's not the same. The correlation over all of physics ranges between 0.26 for those in the sort of low number of quantities to 0.34 for those that are highly downloaded and highly cited. And in high energy physics, a particular subcategory, it reaches up to 50% in terms of the correlation. So correlation is higher for the highest citation papers and whatever, but this is still a really good indicator of how much of an impact is that work going to have. So if you're looking for doing open access, there's a couple models you can look at if you want to publish in journals in general. So the first is traditional subscription models. These are journals that are not free. They may be something like PAMI, IEEE PAMI, or where you get it for being a member of the Right Society for free. So a bunch of people might get it as a non-particular subscription, but libraries and other people have to subscribe to it. In terms of open access, there's what we call gold open access. It's free to the reader, but the author pays the gold, so it's somebody's paying for it. There's platinum open access, which is free to the author and free to the reader. It doesn't cost you anything. CVPR actually operates at a sort of platinum-like model. Neither the author nor the reader actually has to pay, although the author pays something because the author has to attend the conference, which means they paid something. Another model is what's called delayed open access. When we first started with CVPR, this is the model we had worked out with IEEE and what we did for a little while, where it was delayed. The IEEE version was there for a year, and then it became open access to people who did not attend the conference. After a year, it was free for everybody who attended the conference. But we quickly moved away from that and moved to the platinum type model. Green open access is a very popular model and very growing model, which is open access self-archiving, where you have some traditional publication, conference or venue, plus something like, say, archive or your local library, your local university repository. This gives you the advantage that you can have it up and open in terms of access early, maybe often before the conference. But if you're going to go down this path, be very careful to check the rules of publication. Not all venues allow it. Not all venues allow it before their publication. They often want to be the first one to publish it. They may allow you to put it on archive, it was called a postprint, which is once it's up on their site and they've got the press for the sort of news coming out, then you can publish it on archive. Others allow you to do it anytime you want. So there's some economic things. I'm going through a bunch of slides based on Jeffrey Beal up at CU Denver. There's some reasons why open access has caused some problems. The change from subscription financing of journals to author financing of journals has had many negative, unanticipated effects. And this is the only part of open access that I think has been, one of two that has been very problematic. The business model focuses on authors as a revenue source, and now there's sort of a conflict of interest. The more papers that are accepted by a journal, the more income they get. So they have this conflict. They don't necessarily want to reject your paper because you don't pay unless your paper gets published as an author. Not all subscription journals are good. Not all open access journals are bad. So that's not an instant ramification. But the conflict of interest has led to what Jeffrey Beal has been calling a predatory publisher, which I think is a good term for it. These are publishers that exploit their golden open access model for their own profit. They're often for-profit. They sometimes are extremely misleading. You can't even figure out where they're based. They'll say they're in Switzerland, but they're actually in the Ukraine or something. They take advantage of and exploit and pander to scholarly authors who are unaware. As a young professional starting in this field, one of the reasons I'm pointing out is I don't want you to be caught up by this. They pretend to be legitimate, copying established journals and their websites to look like good places. Sometimes they will differ in one or two letters from something that's very well known. But many of them do a poor or fake peer review. There's nothing going on. And while Beal addresses the idea of predatory publishers in the journal, I would say there are also equally predatory conferences that are there to make money for the people who are organizing them and don't have much call for quality. So if you look at this article over here, call for issues from this particularly predatory publisher, you might see something that is an instant indication that something is a problem. Let's see, your submission was due October 27th. On October 29th, you would be notified of acceptance, and on October 31st, it would be published. That is not sufficient time for almost anybody to do a meaningful review of a paper. And if you see that kind of thing, it's almost instantly a sign that this is a junk journal or a predatory publisher. But you have to be careful. They quickly learn that they get called out for this. So many of them have been adding some delays to their process so that they can do this. You have to be careful of these for two reasons. One is you don't want to get sucked up in it, but also you want to be able to identify when people you're interviewing or reviewing for jobs have filled their resume with these. One or two of these on somebody's resume is generally considered a very red flag, and that's probably not somebody you want to hire. Conversely, for you, that's one of the reasons you want to avoid publishing in them. It has some negative impacts in terms of the breakdown of the research cultures. Undoubtedly, some people have earned tenure promotion through articles published in these predatory journals. Right? If you got money, you can publish these things. And sometimes you can even build, there's been a couple of known instances where people have built citations among these predatory journals to make things look more legitimate and more substantial, and that's just bad. So this has had an impact in the role of merit in advancing academic advancement or job placement, so you got to be very careful. It's actually not completely breaking it down because now that people have figured out what they are, they're pretty quick to filter them out. As I said, one of these junk journals in your resume might be reason for people to not trust the rest of what you're doing. Now there are actually blacklists of places where you can say these are the things that are definitely predatory, and people will just do a comparison. Are they on here? But there's a different problem as well. Never before has there been so much pseudoscience published that looks like real science. Some of these look professional, they look reasonable, they sound like they're professional when they're cited, and some of the academic databases are now being filled with junk sciences, and people don't know the difference. Especially the news media, they have no idea sometimes what's going on. Many researchers now expect cheap, fast, and easy publishing. Some of these places charge so little that it doesn't seem predatory. They might charge you $100, but all they're really doing is taking your PDF and putting it up on a website, so they can still make plenty of money that way. Open access advocates are sometimes in denial about the problem that this aspect of open access has caused. It's up to us as a community to police ourselves, and so if we crack down on these, we can handle that and still keep the benefits of open access. It's also possible for articles to be published to open access and still yet hidden. Just because it's open access doesn't mean it's widely known. That's one of the places where making sure you're looking at good venues matter. There have been, if you look around, you'll find articles that talk a little bit about this. Some of the metrics, like H index, can be gained by predatory publishers. Alternative impact measures like ISI, Reuters journal impact can be doing the same thing. This has caused a little bit of a backlash against impact factors and a little bit more of putting quality of the venue on in terms of what's going on. So this was an example that Beal brought up in one of his blog articles. This particular person had a very high citation rate, and Beal noticed that many of his articles came from a small group of these predatory publishers, and sort of called it out on it. And after that, Google Scholar changed some of their processes. As soon as they detect cheating, Google's good at that. In this case, it was brought to their attention. His number of citations dropped from 1,100 to 150. So even some of those may or may not be junk, but it's the quality of the journals are only one impact. ISI has similar issues. Every year, they often ban particular journals for playing games. There have been things which some people call cartels, where different journals, so that if they self-cite, they're not going to get counted. So they come up with an agreement, or have been declared to have come up with an agreement where Journal A cites Journal B cites Journal C, and then they all get, and C cites A, so they all get increases in citation rates. And if they get detected, they sort of manage this. So the goal, obviously, there's certain gaming that can go on, but there's not a lot of evidence of large-scale gaming. Often it's one or two examples, and then once those examples come out, the metrics are changed and cleaned up so that they can't happen. As I've mentioned, these predatory publishers are damaging science. They've increased plagiarism and misconduct. I've actually had one of my own papers ripped off and largely published in one of the junk journals out of India. When someone pointed it out to me, my name was not on the paper, but it was plagiarizing a large amount of it. I was able to get the paper removed from copyright infringement with IEEE's help. But in general, there's lots of problems. Many of those are bad. They don't check anything. Pseudoscience gets published in Index and other places, so you have to do more of a job of checking for junk. Just because it's published doesn't mean much of anything. Just being in Google Scholar doesn't necessarily mean it's good. You have to look at the number of citations and the quality of the venue. They really threaten some of the demarcation between science and pseudoscience, the sort of cumulative nature of research, and their bogus research, bogus results, get fed to institutions that sometimes depend on authentic science, and they can have a real negative impact. There are various places where entrepreneurs, in my view, are using predatory publishers to make their products appear like they're good. They're publishing articles that say this, and then they can point out that they have this 3 or 4 published articles saying that their technique works even though it's garbage, because no one knows that the journal itself is garbage. To make their things look better, there's actually a bunch of fake impact factors. We talked about the journal impact factor, which is published by Reuters Thompson. That's the de facto measure. But that measure is not free. So there's a bunch of things, some of which are set up as free or to sell impact factors. And these are companies that have these other impact factors that are open access. Journal publishers often use to say that they're good or to actually build up the reputation. There are journals that showed up with some of these fake impact factors, and the day the journal was launched, they already had an impact factor rating for some of these. The International Journal Impact Factor was found to be giving out impact factors for things that hadn't even existed for a year. They were just launching, and they still had these impact factors. So they'll often advertise their bogus impact factors. So if you're looking in emails, if you ever receive an email saying, publish with us for free, and you've never heard about it, consider it a Nigerian scam and just walk away from it and put them on the list of people you will never trust. They might try and tempt you by saying, well, you can be a reviewer or an editor for us. You want to maintain your reputation. Don't get associated with those sort of weak places. I do want to differentiate those, though, from something else that you may or may not want to get involved with. There are various author services companies, and they provide services such as copy editing, pre-publication peer review, statistical and methodological review, research promotion. And except for the research promotion, I'm actually for all of those things. If you struggle and you want somebody to help you with your paper, and you got money, you can pay for it. Most of these are not predatory, but the quality varies, so some of them might be predatory because they do such a lousy job. This gives an advantage to those who have money, who submit more polished manuscripts. The more polished your paper, the better its chance of getting published. But I think that's also true. The better the paper, the better its chance. So that's up to you. The cost of publishing scholarly papers with the author is favoring money, which it has for a very long time in my view. Some people say these services are bad because they're giving an advantage to those with money, but those with money have had an advantage for a long time. If you're like me and you struggle with certain kinds of issues, you want to find somebody who can help you. So if English is not your first language, you might want to go through these. I actually use a tool called Grammarly, which I forgot to put a slide up for. But Grammarly, Grammarly, just Google Grammarly. It's like $90 for a year. It'll help you, or $100 for a year. It'll help you with grammar and stuff. And I'll